Hello, I'm Kent Myers.
I'm Mick Cornett, and it's time for the verdict. As a part of its traditional and continuing commitment to public and community service, Crowe and Dunleavy Law Firm presents The Verdict, an objective discussion of contemporary legal issues hosted by Kent Myers. And also brought to you by a friend of Oklahoma Lawyers for Children and Delta Dental Plan of Oklahoma. And welcome to The Verdict. I'm Mick Cornett, and this week's show is called Education Reform. And let me introduce one of Oklahoma's top legal experts and my co-host, Kent Myers. Ken, I think you actually subtitled this show Education Reform Again, because it does seem like we in Oklahoma sometimes go back to the drawing board in education.
Well, we hear it every year, every legislative session, every time candidates run for office. One of the things they want to do is improve education. We're hearing it again now. We want to today take up a couple of topics that go beyond just plain reform. We want to talk about a couple of things that are actually the law today. One is charter schools. We hear a lot about charter schools, and we have two people that know a lot about it today, and to some extent agree and disagree on the charter school issue. We also want to talk about a hot topic that faces rural and urban legislators nose to nose sometime, and that is school consolidation. Do we have too many school districts? And if we cut some of them down, would we save money? But what would happen to the communities that had their school eliminated? These are some of the education issues that we want to talk about today. By no means, not all of the issues that are important, but we're trying to limit it to a 30-minute show rather than a 30-hour show, and so we're going to limit it to these two issues.
Well, typically we take an issue and we have someone that's pro and someone that's con. Today it's not that cut and dry.
Well, we will see. But our two guests agree on many things and disagree on many things, and we'll kind of let the discussion develop and see how it works.
All right, I look forward to it. It's an interesting topic, education reform in Oklahoma, and it should be a lively discussion right here on The Verdict.
It's got to be around here somewhere.
Don't worry, we'll find it. Just calm down.
I swear it was right here on the desk.
All right, if I were a Will, where would I be?
It's the only copy. Without it, we're out $3 million.
I know.
Hey, accidents happen. If a condom breaks
or you have unprotected sex,
you have 72 hours to reduce
your risk of getting pregnant. It's called emergency contraception.
Got questions?
Call Planned Parenthood.
All children deserve a life of hope and love, but sometimes they experience a life of pain, neglect, and abuse.
When that happens, each child deserves all of the quality assistance and representation that can be offered in our legal system. Oklahoma Lawyers for Children has over 350 of the best attorneys and volunteers in Oklahoma County who donate their time and services to represent children. For more information, call 405-23-CHILD.
Oklahoma Lawyers for Children, helping to bring hope and love back to the lives of abused children.
And welcome back to The Verdict. Mick Cornett with Kent Myers. We're ready to discuss the issue of education reform in Oklahoma. And Kent, why don't you introduce our guests?
We have two well-credentialed experts on education in Oklahoma. On my left is Senator Cal Hobson from Norman, Lexington area. Been in the Senate about 10 years, was in the House of Representatives in Oklahoma about 12 years. He's the chairman of the subcommittee on appropriations on education in the Senate and deals with education all the time. On my right is Mr. Patrick McGuigan, the editor of the editorial page of the Daily Oklahoman. Mr. McGuigan is a native Oklahoman, grew up here and went to school here in public and private schools. Has been with the Oklahoman about 10 years and writes on a number of subjects, but obviously pays some particular attention to education and its concerns. Glad to have you, Patrick.
Glad to be here. Thanks.
Let me start out by just asking, why is it that 1017, which we passed, Senator, in the early 90s, hasn't solved all of our educational problems? It seems like it was billed as the saving piece of legislation for education in Oklahoma, and yet we're still talking about needing help.
Well, no one bill is going to fix a system as large as public education, but I can tell you without 1017, thoughtful parents would not want to have their children going to school in Oklahoma. It's made an enormous difference. I'll be quick with a couple of examples.
Good.
We have much lower class size, especially in the early grades. We have greatly enhanced technology, and we're beginning to reap the rewards of those investments 10 years ago, because if you look at the ACT scores now of our juniors and seniors who were first graders back when we passed 1017, those ACT scores are now nearing the national average, and more importantly, they rank first in the entire southern region, beating states like Texas, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, and Florida. So it was a wise investment, and we are seeing the results of that investment.
Mr. McGuigan, how do you view 1017 and its success or lack thereof?
I've been saying for several years that the main thing, in my opinion, analyzing the impact of 1017, the principal one has been that it helped us dodge a bullet that a lot of people might not even have been thinking about at the time, although I think some were, and that's this whole equity issue, which, whether or not it's a legitimate attack on public schools, it has been an issue raised in a number of states, including right now in Vermont, where they're in sort of a nightmarish meltdown in their public school system because of a judicial order requiring very dramatic changes, let's put it that way, in their funding formula. What happened in Oklahoma as a result of 1017 is that we had a degree of centralization of funding that occurred, with some of that money then going back out to the poorer school districts. That pulled in the margins, if you will, in spending in a way that has kept us out of that burr, if you will. I mean, this could be a very difficult problem, because if we hadn't had that degree of centralization, we could already be facing what they're facing in Vermont, and even it's raising its head in Texas and a number of other states. So that's a practical benefit, and I'm glad that we've dodged that. I have a lot of criticisms of 1017. I think that its principal effect in the actual classrooms is this reduction in the teacher-student ratio, which I think makes the lives of the teachers better, but I'm not as convinced that it has as much effect on performance, student achievement, as curriculum, the style of instruction, the content that's presented to the kids. So it's a mixed bag as far as I'm concerned. We were critical of it at the time historically, and it was right when I was coming in at the Oklahoman. I kind of inherited the positions, if you will, that had been crafted by my predecessor, Deacon New, but largely agreed with the critical view because there wasn't enough true reform, dramatic reform. I think that this is what we've continued to do largely in public education, is kind of tinker with small incremental reforms, and I'm hoping that we'll start to be bolder along the lines of things like charter schools that we'll talk about later.
Let's do that now. Let's talk about charter schools. The legislature, Senator Hobson, in 1999 passed some legislation that enabled the creation of charter schools in Oklahoma, but I think many of our viewers are, as I am, not quite sure what a charter school is. I have, on a graphic, pulled a definition out of the statute for charter schools, and it simply says charter schools means a public school and I think that's important to emphasize, established by contract with the Board of Education of a school district to provide learning that will improve student achievement. I take it you were in favor of the establishment of charter schools back in '99 when the bill was passed.
I carried the legislation, handled the legislation on the floor, and believe that the experiment of charter schools is an appropriate part of the entire public school arena here in America. We have 13 school districts that can authorize charter schools. 8 have been applied for in Oklahoma City, 7 have been approved, and so I think it's been the proper process to go slow, know what we're doing, because there are many examples in the country, and many in Texas, that charter schools have been a complete and utter failure and have let the children down. There's been actual fraud and financial failure in a number of them. So I think we did it just about right, provided charter opportunities where there was interest and noise and money, and we'll see how it turns out.
Well, let me ask you a couple of questions, and Patrick, I'd like to get to you on this as well. Let's make no mistake about it. Charter school is a public school.
Public school.
So it has public financing.
It does.
Not private financing.
No. We put rainy day money in, allocated a certain amount of money for each school, and then the money follows the child from our other public schools into the charter schools. So we have not underfunded them.
Why do we have them? What are they accomplishing, Pat, that Gatewood or Hawthorne or schools like that aren't accomplishing?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily be critical of other public schools in advocating continued advancement with charter schools. I think that charter schools are characterized most clearly by a degree of independence from certain traditional bureaucratic strictures and regulations. And I say a degree because it varies from state to state. Oklahoma has a pretty good law in terms of the degree of independence that's granted to the charter school site in that sense.
Why do we care about
but we
it?
only have two only 2 entities are allowed to charter schools: the districts themselves, or in a negotiation with a party at the site, or the Career Tech, formerly Votech schools, and they haven't yet taken up the option to do that. I wish they would. I think that particularly in our 2 cities, the 2 biggest cities, Oklahoma City and Tulsa, that the Career Tech people could play a real helpful role in consciously tailoring some charter schools for specific kinds of students that we might not be able to keep in school otherwise. There's already some pilot programs at some of the Career Tech centers that have probably kept some discernible numbers of kids in school that we would have lost to the dropout statistics otherwise, and I want to keep that going.
Let's hold that thought. We got to take a short break. We'll be right back to The Verdict. We're discussing education reform in Oklahoma. What's your verdict?
Yeah, campfire's a lot of fun. You get to make some friends. You get to do some cool stuff. Campfire's for boys too, not just girls. But hey, campfire's definitely for kids. So call the campfire office nearest you to join in on the fun. 'Cause let's face it, you're not getting any younger.
St. Gregory's University has been changing the lives of people like me for 125 years. Affordable private Catholic education, balanced with dedication to community and service, makes St. Gregory special. We're extremely proud of our students' outstanding academic achievements and our nationally ranked athletic teams. It's when you help a student build a future of balance, integrity, and service that you change a life forever. St. Gregory's, a community for life.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of
America and to the republic for which it stands,
one nation under God, indivisible, with
liberty and justice for all.
Every day Americans make this pledge, but few think about its significance. It's our job to make justice a reality by providing legal representation for all citizens. Legal services, keeping the promise of America.
Every day, in state governments throughout the country, crucial decisions are being made that affect the lives of children and their families. But as this process takes place, children are often left voiceless. When these children raise their hands to be heard, is anyone listening? There are people listening. They are child advocates. Join us and raise your hand for kids.
We're discussing education reform in Oklahoma. Welcome back to The Verdict. Mick Cornett with Kent Myers. Kent, where are we here?
Well, we're talking about charter schools and some of the pluses and minuses. Patrick, tell us a little bit about the criticism that's been leveled recently by an Oklahoma City school board member that charter schools are simply too expensive. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think it's invalid, and the numbers were fixed by the person that studied it for the school district. The only reply I make in short form is if we're going to talk about equity and funding questions, then we ought to start looking at the traditional schools in the district that cost 2 to 2.5 times as much per student as schools like Independence Enterprise or Independence Charter Middle School. If we're going to compare, do those kinds of things, it was a limited examination, and some of the accounting assumptions that were made I object to pretty strenuously. And one point that was made earlier about certainly there have been some failures, although they're a distinct minority among the charter schools around the country. But, you know, there's failures in regular public schools. We regularly have stories in the Oklahoman not only about personnel problems, but also about treasurers of school districts or members of school boards involved in fiscal chicanery. Mm-hmm. And that's not an argument against the existence of those public school districts. It's an argument for having the right kind of oversight in place.
Yeah, we have a human system in Indiana.
That's right.
Well, Senator, another criticism leveled sometimes at charter schools is that they're elitist. They bring about white flight. Mm-hmm. How do you see that issue?
The statute is written in such a way that charter schools, public charter schools, must be open to all. We were very concerned that we got that done, and so...
And you considered that at the time you drafted the legislation?
Absolutely. Bottom line is if your child wants to participate in a charter school, regardless of color and creed, they are welcome to come there. Briefly, I want to say a word about this financing question that Patrick raised. I often disagree with the editorials in the Oak, but his editorial from March of this year that talked about the need for an infusion of between $200 million and $600 million into just the Oklahoma City public school system was right on, and it can be replicated throughout the state of Oklahoma in buildings and technology and infrastructure. So I am four square for more revenue, and I applaud the Oak for recognizing that as it relates to the Oklahoma City School District.
Is that likely to come out of this session at all?
Of course not. We have $100 million total for all educational investment, kindergarten through graduate school, including career tech.
What the legislation Cal's referring to gives us the flexibility to do, and it's been done in one community, Lawton, is to have the possibility for those purposes he described to bring in additional revenues through a local sales tax, and that's what we're discussing in Oklahoma City. And, you know, that keeps the decision at the level that ideally, I think, it's most appropriate to have it at, and that's right there in the community. Of course, I want to get a lot of real substantive reforms to go with that new money, and that's another part of what we're working on in Oklahoma City.
Sounds like a good subject for another show.
Yes, it does.
Let me change the subject. Let's bring up another issue of school consolidation. We have 544 school districts in Oklahoma. Do we have too many? Should some be consolidated? Should some go out of existence? What do you think, Senator?
1017 brought the consolidation of about 70 to 75 schools. We used to have 600 and something in the 50s in this state. We had over 3,000 school districts. Bottom line is this. I live in the little town of Lexington. When you close a town school, then Main Street follows, and what you're doing is basically saying that's the death knell of that little town. We've moved in the proper direction, slowly, I admit, on school consolidation. I think there are more increments to go, but they must be weighed against topography, distance, those kinds of issues. And we must be sensitive, those of us that are fortunate enough to live in the two urban areas, that there are people in the far southeastern part of the state, people in the far western part of the state, that consolidation is like a rifle at their head. And you have to understand that as you talk about that topic in any legislative process related to the public schools.
Yeah, let's look at a graphic. I think that may point up the rural-urban split a little bit. Representative Jack Begley, a Democrat from Goodwell, said, quote, "We do not need corporation CEOs, college economists, and big city leaders telling us what is best for rural education." Well, Patrick, without trying to figure out where you fall within that, what do you think about that?
Well, I think it was an unfortunate comment, and Begley, it's even conceivable he might want to revisit it in light of, some of the trends. I mean, you look at the population the static population in western Oklahoma,
What do you mean
and in other,
static
they're just flat or even declining in some
Okay.
counties. We've got to think about that in creative ways. If it's not consolidation, then we've got to think about how do you deliver the kind of education these youngsters need in a modern world, whether they're living in a rural area or an urban area, and do it efficiently and in a cost-effective manner. And I don't know how you can maintain some of those schools in the smaller communities. It's not quite either or. If we think about our market centers and our places where there is a critical mass on population in the countryside and build a good educational structure around those, maybe move some of the schools from high school down to just having in the community just the primary grades, and then they go elsewhere for high school. Maybe we can get there. But we've got to be clear-eyed about this because we don't have the resources to maintain that many school districts and pay that many superintendents.
Why don't we stop there, and I'd like to give each of them 30 or 40 seconds to kind of sum up their feelings on this subject. Senator Hobson, why don't you go first?
Education is the most important topic I get to work on each day. I've been in the legislature over these past 23 years. It always will be. The most important thing we can do is to provide a quality public education system to every child in Oklahoma. And we should recognize that in Oklahoma, 95% of our students go to public schools, and in this country, 90% of the kids do. And somebody is working in this wonderful economy called America, and they are primarily products of the public school system.
Mr. McGuigan?
Well, a reflection of how important education is the fact that, I have 10 opinion pages a week, one every day, and then the extra pages 3 days. And one of those pages every week is devoted almost exclusively to education, some weeks exclusively. That's an indication of how important this issue is for the future. On those statistics that Senator Hobson mentioned, 5% of the kids in our state do go to private schools. We need to think not only about charter education, but also ways that we can make that system even more dynamic. Because one of the secrets of those states that are more successful economically is that differential. We've got to make our public schools better, and if anything, make it easier to access private education for people that choose to do that in order to make our whole state better.
Well, I can already tell we got more shows coming on this subject.
We do.
That's right. We got to wrap it up right there. Senator Hobson, Mr. McGuigan, thank you for coming by. We'll be right back.
In Oklahoma, there are more than 1,600 children waiting to be adopted. They're of all ages, and for many, home has been a source of pain and conflict. They've dreamed of finding a better life and a loving family. Consider adoption. For more information, call 1-877-OK-SWIFT or visit the website www.okdhs.org. Adopt. It may be the toughest job you'll ever love.
bringing out the best in each student. That is the simple goal and tradition of Heritage Hall. The focus on the individual shapes the educational experience at Heritage Hall. Each student benefits from small classes, able, dedicated teachers, a solid academic curriculum, and exceptional co-curricular programs of athletics, arts, community service, and other activities, parental involvement, personalized counseling, and the development of responsibility, integrity, and love of learning. If you want education taught with pride, then you want Heritage Hall.
And welcome back to The Verdict. Well, Kent, we're here to wrap it up. You know, I think every American believes that every child should have the opportunity to have an equal and good education. These charter schools, though sometimes they have an image of being elitist. What do you think on that?
Well, it's clear they are providing something that is not being provided in every public school, or we wouldn't need them. If they were exactly the same, we wouldn't have to have independently formed and contracted schools. It is really an experiment that seems to be going the right way. It is freeing the school up from strictures of public regulation, and yet still using public funds. And that brings about an accountability question. It brings about some of the issues we talked about today as being concerns. But we're progressing at a reasonable pace on this experiment, it seems like, and time will tell whether it's a good experiment or a bad one. But we're certainly into it, and all indications are that it's moving along the right track.
Well, in preparing for this show, one thing we established in ourselves was we have a lot more topics to cover concerning education.
We do. Consolidation, we talked about briefly. Very hot rural-urban issue. Which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Which comes first, the school or the community? You destroy the school, do you destroy the community?
Right.
A really tough topic.
It is. And ultimately, how do we determine which schools are doing well and which schools are not? I mean, is there a test score that you can look at, or is there another way? And I think that could be another topic that we would want to look at.
Well, the only thing we can promise our viewers is that we will have another show on education.
All right. Ken, thank you. Thanks again to our guest also, State Senator Cal Hobson and the editor of the Daily Oklahoman's editorial page, Patrick McGuigan. For Kent Myers, I'm Mick Cornett, and we'll see you next time on The Verdict. This program was brought to you by Crow and Dunlevy, a professional corporation, and also brought to you by a friend of Oklahoma Lawyers for Children and Delta Dental Plan of Oklahoma.